Hi everyone, and welcome to the True Experiment video lecture. Now previously, we've briefly touched on the idea of experiments during our data collection strategy module. In this lecture video, we're going to go more in depth about the different types of experimental designs. True experiments are the gold stars of experimental designs because they contain all possible safety blocks to help us make accurate cause and effect determinations. There are several types of true experimental designs that we'll talk about, but all of these share three criteria. First, they will have an experimental and a control group. The experimental group is going to receive the independent variable and the control group will not. This allows the researcher to determine if the cause actually produces the intended effect or if there's another variable playing into the relationship. Second, the experimental and control groups must be selected using random assignment. Now, this is a common point of confusion for students. There are actually two places for randomization in experimental design, and I'm talking about one of those specific places. So we can draw a random sample from the population using the probability sampling methods that we've learned previously. The goal of this random selection is to ensure that the sample represents the larger population. But this isn't the randomization that I'm talking about here. Random assignment means that once a sample is selected, the sample is split randomly into the control and the experimental groups. So they are randomly assigned to either receive the independent variable as the experimental group or to not receive the independent variable as the control group. Experimental designs may or may not include random sampling from the population, but they must contain random assignment from the sample into the experimental and control groups in order to be a true experiment. Finally, the third requirement of a true experimental design is that we can manipulate the treatment variable or the independent variable. Simply put, the independent variable must be something we can introduce into the situation. This is important because true experimental designs are going to try and measure the dependent variable both before and after the independent variable occurs. So if the independent variable already exists, for example, like gender or race, then the ability to measure before will be hindered. The goal of random assignment is that we want the experimental and control groups to be as similar as possible. By using random assignment, we ensure that these two groups will resemble each other. However, in some cases, we can use a non-random assignment process to achieve the same equality between control and experimental groups. One such method is called paired matching. This means that every person in the experimental group is matched with a person in the control group using specific characteristics of interest. So if you think pet ownership is important to control for in your experiment, and you have a female college student who owns a dog in the experimental group, you will try and pair her up with another female college student who owns a dog in the control group. Block matching is more similar to stratified sampling than anything else. First, you take the sample and you separate them into groups based on one or more characteristics that you're interested in studying. Then use random assignment to split each group into their own experimental and control group and conduct the study accordingly. For example, in the diagram here, the 1,200 subjects are split into male and female groups. Then within each gender group, random assignment is used to create an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is given drug X and the control group is given a placebo. And then the results are compared separately for the male experiment and the female experiment. Now I want to move us into a discussion about the different types of experimental design. These are going to be really important to understand and to be able to identify, as the type of experimental design has multiple implications for the reliability and the validity of the conclusions. To help you understand the specifics of each experimental design, I'm going to use a mapping technique that helps you visualize the different components. In this mapping exercise, we will use the following labels. X stands for the independent variable, O stands for the observation of the dependent variable by the researchers, and a capital R stands for random assignment. Your experimental design maps will also include the labels of pretest, post-test, treatment, experimental group, and control group. The first type of true experimental design that we'll discuss is the two-group pretest, post-test, or what is more commonly referred to as the ideal experiment. This is a longitudinal design that allows for multiple comparisons. So let's look at what exactly this design looks like. To start an experimental design map, I want you to draw out a 3x4 grid. Along the top, you're going to include the labels pretest, treatment, and post-test. Along the sides, you'll include the labels experimental group and control group. Now the top left box is left empty, so I like to include the experimental design name there if you already know it. In this case, it's going to be the ideal experiment. Other than the experiment label, you will create this exact same chart for every experimental design map that you complete. What we'll work on is filling out the specific details about the experiment itself. First, we're going to put a capital O under the pretest column for both the experimental and the control groups. Remember that O stands for observation of the dependent variable. So in an ideal experiment, we're going to measure the level of the dependent variable before we start the experiment. This measurement is called our pretest. Then we're going to introduce our independent variable, denoted as an X under the treatment column. Since the control group never gets the treatment by definition, this X will only appear in the experimental group row. And finally, we're going to put an O, capital O, in the post-test column for both the experimental groups and the control groups again. So what this design is telling us is that everyone in the sample is tested for the presence and the level of the dependent variable. Then the experimental group only receives the treatment, and then everyone in the sample is tested again. There's one last part of the ideal experiment that we haven't documented on our map yet. Remember that true experiments require random assignment, which we said on the previous slide would be represented by a capital R. We put this R on the map outside to indicate a random assignment into experimental and control groups. And ta-da, we're done. This is the experimental design map for an ideal experiment. Here's an example of that same experimental design. The dependent variable is being observed with a paper survey. Everyone in this sample, experimental and control groups, take the survey. Then the experimental group watches our movie, our independent variable, while the control group chills out. Then everyone in the sample takes the survey again. The advantage of the experimental design is shown in with these two blue arrows. Researchers can compare the experimental group changes in two ways. First, they can compare post-test values to pre-test values. Has the movie made a difference? Second, they can compare post-test values of the experimental group to the post-test values of the control group. This is an important way to identify spurious relationships. If there is something else that's going on that affects the survey responses, then the control group will also show a change in the dependent variable, even though, even though they didn't receive the treatment. So this tells our researcher that they need to look for something outside of what they're measuring that's having an effect on the responses. Another true experimental design is the post-test only experimental design. This design has both an experimental and a control group, but it doesn't include a pretest. In terms of an experimental map, we start with the same basic layout. We add in our 3x4 group and we put all the labels up that we had before. This time changing the name to a two-group post-test only instead of ideal experiment. Now this time we're going to leave the pretest column blank because there is no pretest. Instead, we start with the X for the treatment and then we add a post-test to both groups. And once again, we will use random assignment, so we include our R to the left of the map. As you can see, the major limitation of the post-test only experimental design is that without a pretest, we cannot compare the pretest to the post-test values. We must use the control group instead to make assumptions about what those values would have been, since we did not introduce the independent variable to that group, and so we don't expect a change in response. However, the post-test only experimental design can be a really helpful way to measure a relationship when there are concerns about a pretest that impacts the post-test values. The last type of experimental group that I want to show you is the Solomon 4-group design. Now it's a little out of depth for this course, so I don't actually expect you to apply this at any time, but I want you to be familiar with what this design is. The Solomon 4-group design is a combination of the ideal experiment with the post-test only experimental design. Instead of being randomly assigned to a single experimental or control group, the sample is randomly assigned to one of 4 groups. 2 of these will receive the treatment, but only one of these experimental groups will receive a pretest. Similarly, there are 2 possible control group assignments, neither of which will receive the treatment, but only one of them that will receive the pretest. Because of the duplication of experimental and control groups, the Solomon 4-group design allows for several more comparison options that are not achievable within the ideal or the 2-group design only. All right, well, that concludes our discussion about true experiments. Join me in the next video as I map out the experimental designs that don't meet the requirements to be called a true experiment. Thanks for watching, everyone.